Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scotty Kirkland, and I am the Exhibits, Publications, and Programs Coordinator here at the Department of Archives and History. I'd like to welcome you to another edition of Research Rundown, History and Genealogy How-Tos from the Archives. Before we begin today, I just have a few quick announcements for you. Our 2023 Food for Thought Lunchtime Lecture Series will conclude later this month on December 21st at noon. Our very own Haley Aaron, who serves as the Archives Registrar, will present Spaces of Self, Diaries and Scrapbooks of Young Alabamians. That program will begin at noon here in our Farley Auditorium at the Archives. It will also stream on both our Facebook and YouTube pages. Our 2024 Food for Thought Lecture Series schedule will be released very soon, so watch our website, social media channels for that announcement. One final announcement, if you still have any holiday shopping to accomplish, I invite you to visit the museum store here at the Archives. You'll find a raft of Alabama history books and other products made by talented people who call Alabama home. The store will be open this Thursday, December 7th, for extended hours until 6:30, and you can always shop anytime at the online store as well, shopalabamaoriginal.com. Now it gives me great pleasure to turn the floor over to Courtney Pinkard, who serves as our reference coordinator here at the Archives. Our topic today is the history and resources related to Prohibition in Alabama. If you have questions for Courtney during the presentation, just drop those in the chat and we'll have a discussion about them at the end of the presentation. Courtney, welcome back, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Scotty. And hello, everybody. As Scotty said, I am Courtney Pinkard, and I am the reference coordinator here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. I'm really excited to talk to you today about the history of Prohibition in Alabama. And I am going to be mostly focusing on the historical side of things, but I'm also going to try to incorporate some genealogy related resources as well. And these are going to be probably some sources that are kind of off the beaten path. Maybe you haven't considered consulting these types of sources and record types before in your genealogy research. So hopefully we'll learn a little bit about Prohibition and also just get some ideas for further, family history research at the same time. Tomorrow, December 5th, is actually the 90th anniversary of the repeal of Prohibition. So that happened on December 5th, 1933, and that's national prohibition. But as we're going to find, the state of Alabama actually had its own version of a prohibition law that was statewide, that was in effect for 2 years before national prohibition was established with the 18th Amendment. So Alabama has had a long and storied and sometimes tumultuous relationship with the idea of using legal channels, to control and restrict the manufacture, sale, and consumption of alcoholic beverages. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in, and we're going to start discussing, like I said, the historical aspect, but also the genealogy aspect as well. All right, so to get started, so Alabama passed its first liquor license law in 1820, which was just 2 years after it attained statehood. The first dry area in the state was created by the legislature with an act in 1835, and it restricted liquor sales within the town limits of the town of LaGrange and for a 3-mile radius outside of the town. Both federal and state governments levied taxes on liquor sales and also required distillers to pay for a license to be able to operate legally. And I do very much emphasize the word legally there. Both of those avenues were efficient ways for our young state government to raise additional revenue. However, religious and civic organizations consistently rejected the idea that the sale and manufacture of liquor and other alcoholic beverages was just a necessary evil, and instead they agitated for temperance. And this resulted in a series of state laws that were eventually passed in the 1870s that banned the sale of alcohol to minors, persons of an unsound mind, and persons of known intemperate habits. Alabama's state government first became heavily involved in regulating the manufacture and sale of liquor during the Civil War. The governors of that era used their power to place emergency restrictions on the use of corn and wheat for distilling, since those products were very badly needed to feed soldiers, civilians, and livestock. As conditions became more dire across the South, the Confederate government passed a law that allowed the Surgeon General of the Confederate States to make contracts with distillers to manufacture whiskey, brandy, and other liquor for medicinal use. Governor John G. Shorter was in office when the first wartime liquor restrictions were passed in 1862, and his papers contain a variety of interesting documents that are related to distilling. There are letters to the governor complaining about local law violators. There's petitions that request authorization for someone to distill legally. And there are also lists of the contractors that were licensed by the Confederate government to distill liquor for the use of the military. So this is an example of one of those contractor lists, and the list gives the issue date of the license to distill, the name of the distiller, the location of their still, the government officer who established the contract with them, and the amount of product that the contractor was obligated to produce. Some contractors were given a specific amount in gallons or bottles, and a few had unlimited license to distill as much product as they could. This list shows mostly whiskey being produced, but the contractor in Montgomery County was actually contracted to make vinegar, which could be used as an antiseptic, but was also being given to soldiers because they believed that it could prevent scurvy. Spoiler alert, it doesn't prevent scurvy. So this next example, also from Governor Shorter's papers, is a letter that was written to the governor by two men in Pickens County. They were requesting his permission to distill whiskey, and they promised that their operation will not consume very much corn or be a waste of grain, and they're happy to share their product with their neighbors. Very generous. We actually have Governor Shorter's handwritten response on the back of the letter, which reads, "Have allowed in few instances distilling for medicinal use, but owing to complaints of abuse have determined to refuse all further licenses. I refer the whole matter to the legislature." And finally, we have this letter from Louisa Leverett of Chambers County. She was born in Maine and grew up in Massachusetts, and she attended Mount Holyoke College, but she left school early to become a missionary. She and her first husband, the Reverend William Towers, established churches and schools in Georgia and Alabama. Her first husband passed away in 1840, and in 1841 she married another minister, Reverend John G. Leverett. Louisa had some very strong feelings about the actions the Confederate government was taking to create distilleries and enable contractors to distill whiskey in large quantities. She acknowledges in her letter that while Governor Shorter had effectively shut down the privately owned local distilleries, she believed that the little monster has been metamorphosed into a huge monster, and that government-run distilleries would be abused by those in power. The governor replied to Louisa, but we actually don't have a copy of his response. So the actions of state government during the Civil War demonstrated to the prohibitionists that they could use legal channels to control or outright stop the production and consumption of alcohol. Throughout the second half of the 1800s, local laws were enacted that created dry areas within the counties. Between 1866 and 1880, dry locations were created around 146 churches, 35 schools, 37 towns, 15 coal mines, and 13 factories. This local legislation usually prohibited the sale of liquor within a specific radius of the landmark in question, ranging from 1 to 6 miles. In 1874, the local option was written into state law, which allowed the probate judges of 22 counties to hold a special election and let their citizens vote on whether liquor could be sold legally within their county. If the majority of voters supported prohibition, the judge was no longer allowed to issue liquor licenses, and liquor sales would become illegal within that area. The published legislative acts from the 1870s contain pages upon pages regarding the restriction of liquor sales, as you can see in this excerpt from the index of the 1874-1875 legislative acts. The selective prohibition movement reached a crescendo in 1880 when state legislatures introduced a wave of bills from across the state. Ultimately, there were 145 local laws that were passed to ban the sale of liquor in that one single legislative session. Ahead of the session, citizens circulated petitions both for and against the local bills, which they submitted to the state to indicate their support for prohibition or lack thereof. The archives has preserved the petitions from 19 counties and some petitions where a specific county was not indicated on the petition itself. So those are marked as location unknown. They're digitized and available on our digital collections page. This image is an excerpt from the petition that was circulated in Chilton County, and it was against the restriction of the sale of alcohol within a 1.5-mile radius of Walnut Creek Church. The author of the petition uses some really flowery language in the introduction section, and it almost starts out reading like a resolution because he uses the whereas format. The author claims that the only reason the bill was being introduced was because there were liquor retailers in the town of Clanton that wanted to put a competitor out of business by targeting the specific area of the county where that person was operating. They ended up getting a total of 85 signatures from residents that lived within the affected area. Okay, sorry. My slides hesitated there for a second. So just by coincidence, my paternal grandmother's family lived in the Walnut Creek community. And as you can see from this excerpt from the signature list, I have multiple direct ancestors that signed. Two of my paternal third great grandfathers and one of my paternal fourth great grandmothers are on this page. And in fact, I'm related by blood or marriage to 31 out of the 85 total signatories. Sadly, the petition failed to stop the passage of the bill, and as shown in the image on the right, Act Number 121 forbid the sale of liquor within a 1.5-mile radius of Walnut Creek Church. So my ancestors were not successful in their bid to overcome that bill that was being introduced that year. Eventually, after so many years of passing these local laws that carved up each county into Swiss cheese with random pockets of dry territory scattered all over the place, the prohibitionists began to agitate for a statewide total ban on the sale of liquor. They were successful in 1908 when the legislature passed the first statewide prohibition law. However, the Dries knew that such an act could be easily overturned with the next legislative session, and in 1909 they launched a crusade to have prohibition added to the state's constitution as an amendment. Their efforts failed, and in 1911, sure enough, the state was reverted back to local option, which, as you'll recall, meant that each county's probate judge could hold a special election to let the voters determine whether their county would be wet or dry. Then the next legislature put the statewide prohibition law back onto the books. And after July 1st, 1915, no liquor was legally, again, that word legally, manufactured in the state of Alabama. Illegal stills were common in rural areas, and liquor retailers could still obtain a liquor license from the federal government, even though that technically violated the state law. So if you're doing research about the various phases of prohibition in Alabama, you really need to check out newspapers.com. You can find a lot of commentary about liquor sales and manufacturing, local and statewide laws, lists of licensed retailers, and propaganda both for and against prohibition in the state's various newspapers. These three articles are from the Montgomery Advertiser in 1910 and 1918. When you're using newspapers.com, you've got the added advantage of being able to keyword search the paper. So not only can you look for a specific person's name, but you can also put in keywords like liquor or prohibition, and you'll get lots of results. In fact, that's exactly how I stumbled across the early 1920s exploits of Sheriff John L. Gore. Sheriff Gore only served one term as the sheriff of Chilton County, but during that time he was very aggressive about enforcing prohibition laws. There are numerous articles in the Clanton newspaper, the Union Banner, that detail the escapades of the sheriff and his deputies. In fact, he even took his 70-year-old father along on some of his still-busting raids, as shown by this photo. Sheriff Gore is on the far right, and his father, Wiley Gore, is on the far left. There were so many articles in the Union Banner about Sheriff Gore that I had a hard time narrowing down which one I wanted to use to illustrate his prohibition enforcing activities, but I thought this one was a good example. Apparently, he used an axe to destroy 14 stills in one day in front of the courthouse in Clanton. There's another thrilling episode that's detailed in the Union Banner where a moonshiner caught in the act pointed a high powered rifle at the sheriff, and this is a quote from the newspaper article, in a manner that must have looked like he was ready to declare war and begin defense of his realm. But Sheriff Gore was able to fire a shot from his shotgun first, and the offender dropped his rifle and ran away from the still and was eventually captured. Of course, within a few years of Alabama's second statewide prohibition law, the federal government enacted a nationwide version. The Alabama legislature ratified the 18th Amendment on January 14, 1919, then 4 days later passed the Weekly Enforcement Bill, which was nicknamed the Bone Dry Law. I would hazard a guess that this law was Sheriff Gore's favorite, or at least one of his favorites, if not his absolute favorite. The Bone Dry Law passed in 1919. It supported prohibition by making it a misdemeanor for local judges to suspend sentences for violating prohibition laws. And it allowed law enforcement officers to confiscate illegal liquor, distilling equipment, buildings and or property where the illegal distilling took place, and even vehicles that were used to transport liquor, including boats, planes, and animals. It created a state level law enforcement agency to help bring violators to justice, which was essentially the predecessor of the Department of Public Safety, which we know today as ALEA, the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, and it set the recommended sentence for violating prohibition laws at 1 to 5 years of hard labor in the state penitentiary. Arrests for violating the new prohibition laws started out kind of slow, but they increased throughout the 1920s as enforcement became more organized and aggressive. And I'm sure Sheriff Gore wasn't the only one out there busting stills and hauling the shiners off to the county jail. If you're curious about an ancestor's brush with the law, prohibition related or otherwise, the archives has two collections related to incarceration that have been digitized and made available on ancestry.com. In fact, you can search the collection for free without an active subscription to Ancestry, but you have to keep in mind that you won't be able to view the actual record without paying. So you'll be able to see if your ancestor's name shows up in the collection, but you won't be able to look at the actual record and get the information it contains, if that makes sense. Some of these records are going to be more descriptive than others, but common information that you can find would be the convict's name, age, physical description, the crime they committed, the sentence they received, whether they received parole and or a discharge, and the dates that were associated with those events if they occurred, and if they submitted an appeal. And you can also tell if they were eventually granted a pardon. If you'd like to search the convict records on Ancestry, you have to know where to look for them. They're under the Alabama specific collections, which you can find by either clicking the pin dropped into Alabama on the map or by clicking the link for Alabama under the map. As shown in the as you can see in the left image. If you click on the dropped pin, you'll have to make an additional click to view all Alabama research options. But if you click on the state name in the list that's under the map, it's just going to take you straight to the page where you can see all of our state-specific collections. If you scroll down to almost the bottom of the list, you'll see the link for Alabama U.S. convict records 1886 to 1952. Once you've found an ancestor's convict record, you can sometimes use the information contained to locate other records related to their legal journey. You might find that they filed an appeal of their conviction, as shown with this convict record for a man named Ramsey Shaddix. Ramsey's case was sent to the Court of Appeals in 1931 and affirmed in 1932. The Archives has case files for the Court of Appeals starting with its creation in 1911 and all the way up to 1990. So I should be able to locate a copy of the case file for Ramsey's appeal. If you're trying to find a Court of Appeals case at the Archives, there are 3 pieces of information that you absolutely must have in order to locate the case. You'll need to know the year or term that the case was heard, the judicial division number, and the Court of Appeals case number that was assigned to the case. We're still going to use the Shaddix appeal as an example, and all I have in that case is the county where the circuit court trial happened and a year. I'm still missing the judicial division number and the Court of Appeals case number. We have a document at the reference desk that shows which counties fall under which judicial divisions, and I used that to determine that at the time, Winston County was part of the 6th Judicial Division. But I'm still missing that third piece of our puzzle, the case number. If I have the year and division, I can use a record called the docket to help me get a case number. With all 3 pieces of the puzzle, I'll have enough information to pull the exact volume that I need. Here's a scan of the page of the docket that provides information about the Shaddix case. The red square at the bottom left shows the tabbing system, which organizes the entries inside the docket by their judicial division number. If I didn't already have that information, I would have had to look through every division in this volume, but I had already figured out that I was looking for an appeal from the 6th Judicial Division, so I was able to go straight to the number 6 tab. The other red box is indicating the Court of Appeals case number, which for the Shaddix appeal was case number 218. Now I have all 3 pieces that I need to find the case file for this appeal: the year or term, which is 1931 to 1932, the judicial division number, which is 6, and the case number, 218. Using the finding aid for the Court of Appeals case files, I can see that case numbers 183 to 243 from the 6th Division are located in CAP 0531. CAP 0531 is the call number that I'm going to need to get the case file pulled. And sure enough, here's a scan of the first page of the Court of Appeals case. It's case number 218 from the 6th Division, heard in the 1931-1932 term. The content of the appeals case is going to vary depending on what was sent up to the appeals court from the circuit court at the county level. Sometimes you're just going to have a tiny snippet of the testimony that was heard in the original trial. Sometimes you'll get the entire transcript of the trial from beginning to end with all of the witness testimony. The Shaddix case seemed to kind of fall in the middle. There was testimony of some witnesses included, but I don't think we got the entire transcript. I was able to figure out that Ramsey Shaddix pled not guilty to violating prohibition laws because while he was technically arrested next to the moonshine still, he claimed that he was in the woods that day foraging for poke salad. There was one witness that testified that a lot of pokeweed grew in that specific part of the woods where the still was, but another person said they had never seen poke salad in that area, so who knows. Either way, Ramsey's conviction stood, and he served 5 months of his 1-year sentence at Atmore Prison before he was paroled. The executive pardon is another type of state document that might be mentioned in the remarks section of a convict record. Until 1939, when the Board of Pardons and Paroles was created as a separate state agency, the authority to grant pardons ultimately rested with the governor. In this example, we see that a convict named Mooch Otwell received a pardon from the governor in 1936, which restored his civil and political rights. Mooch was a truck driver living in Birmingham who was arrested for transporting illegal liquor in 1930. He ended up being discharged from Atmore Prison after serving 7 months, and then his full pardon was issued 5 years later. We have a few different collections which document the process of receiving pardons and paroles. And for me to try to explain the whole history of paroling and pardoning in the state of Alabama, it, it could probably be its own separate research rundown. But for this specific example, I chose to look for a copy of Mooch's executive pardon in the executive orders for full pardons because the description of the collection mentions prohibition violations specifically. And here is Mooch's executive pardon, which was signed by Governor Graves and stamped by the Secretary of State. It's pretty typical, of a executive pardon. They don't have a ton of information on them, but most of the time they're going to have the subject's name, the county, the offense, the conviction date, and their sentence. And the format of these form letters, they do change a little bit over time, but most of the time they are going to include the details that I just listed. After 13 years, the National Prohibition um, Amendment was repealed in 1933, but sentiment against the prohibition laws in Alabama had already started to turn as early as 1931. That year, the legislature passed a law that allowed circuit court judges to suspend sentences for violating prohibition laws, and they were able to then convert those sentences to probation instead. The language of that law doesn't specifically mention prohibition or liquor law violations in its text, but as opponents were quick to point out, prohibition violations were the only type of sentence that judges weren't allowed to suspend at that time. So it could only be applicable to those types of convictions. In 1937, a statewide referendum was held for the voters of each county to decide if they would be wet or dry, with 24 counties voting to repeal prohibition in their county and become wet, and 43 voting to remain dry. At the same time, the Alcoholic Beverage Control Board was established and began operating state-run liquor stores in those counties that had voted to become wet. To this day, the ABC Board operates liquor stores, issues liquor licenses to businesses, and enforces state laws and regulations regarding alcohol sales. All right, and that's going to wrap it up for me. Thank you so much, everybody. If we have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen here. There we go. So if anybody's got any questions, I'm happy to answer.
All right. Well, thank you, Courtney. That was terrific. It's a really rich topic for sure, and one that's quite entertaining. Let's start with a real specific question. If someone located on Ancestry a convict record for an ancestor, you walked us through how they could work to determine more about that particular case, but how else can the research room help fill out the contours of that person's life for our researchers?
Yeah, so if you're interested in learning more about an ancestor's life outside of their legal journey, so to speak, you've got a couple options. So you're always welcome to come into the research room. We are open Tuesday through Saturday, 8:30 to 4:30, and we have lots of resources here that can help, family history researchers. So you can come in and one of our archivists can work with you to find out more information about your ancestor. And the other option, if you're not able to make it in, you can always submit a research request on our website, and you can find the link under the research tab on the homepage. And if you'll just give us the information that you have about the ancestor in question, then that will be routed to one of our reference archivists. They will research the person on your behalf and then send you copies of whatever they find.
Yes, that research tab opens up a whole new world for you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You had several clips from Alabama newspapers in your presentation today, and I know that you mentioned a few times newspapers.com, which for researchers is just a wonderful resource. Tell us how the public can access newspapers.com. There are a couple of ways, right?
Yeah, so newspapers.com, it is a subscription-based site, just like Ancestry or Fold3. If you wanted to use newspapers.com at home, you have to pay the subscription. But we have an institutional subscription to it here in the research room, and it's always free for you to search here. And that the same goes for other paid sites like Ancestry, Fold3, History Geo, which is good for land record research. So, while you may have to subscribe to those websites at home, if you want to use them at home, you can always come in, use one of our public access computers here in the research room, and get those resources for free.
That's terrific. And speaking of free resources, our digital collections, which you've mentioned a few times, you had some of Governor Shorter's records. Tell us about the other governor's papers that are available on our digital collection, please.
Yeah. So we had a big project that just recently wrapped up where we were digitizing the papers of the Civil War and Reconstruction era governors. And, we also have digitized the papers of some administrations that predate the Civil War and Reconstruction years. But these have their own little separate home in the digital collections page. And I think I actually did a rundown. I think our previous series talking about the types of records that you can find in the governor's papers, and they're just really a rich resource. You just find all kinds of information and just interesting stories will come out of those. I actually kind of stumbled across the letters and documents that I used out of Governor Shorter's papers. I found that while I was researching the other rundown. And, I was really fascinated by all of these documents related to distilling and licensing for, liquor manufacture for medicinal use, for military use. And I don't know that I was able to really get it into that other rundown. And so that kind of was the seed, I think, of wanting to talk about Prohibition. And of course, the anniversary that's coming up tomorrow, the 90th anniversary of the repeal. But anyway, that's just one tiny example of something that you can stumble across, in those governor's papers. They really just have a huge variety of types of records and topics that come up.
You're right, Courtney. Sometimes the stories do find you. They really do.
Yeah.
And that's one of the great things about research. And so much is on our digital collection now that you can really start so much of this journey right at your own home before you ever submit your research request and have a research appointment and come in. So, well, anything else you'd like to add before we close, Courtney?
No, if that's all the questions we've got, I think we're good.
All right. Well, just a reminder to our audience, a few of you came in a little late. You can go back beginning in just a few minutes and watch this research rundown and all the other ones and all of our other public programs on the Archives YouTube page. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this edition of Research Rundown. Our next program in the series will happen on Monday, January the 8th, and that will be our education curator, Dr. Hayden McDaniel, who will talk to us about ways to navigate the Alabama History Hub, which is a resource for teachers and students on the Archives website. So that program begins at noon on Monday, January 8th, streaming right here, and we look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks for watching, and be well.
Thanks.